Welcome to our CTV post-election analysis, where we're going to analyze the results of the recent June 5th, 2018 California primary election. I'm James Bozajian, Calabasas City Council member. I'm joined today by my colleague, Fred Gaines, Mayor of Calabasas. Fred, this is our 13th year of doing this show together, and I really do enjoy being with you, even though we don't always agree.
That's what makes it fun.
Yes, we had a recent election in California, and we're going to analyze the results and give it a little bit of a local angle. What are some of the takeaways you got from this election?
Well, first of all, this is one of the first elections under our new process, top two. And we had some interesting twists this year that we didn't see even in the previous top two elections, with Democrats campaigning for Republicans, hoping they'd get in the runoff, and some new tactics of campaigning that we hadn't really seen before. Very low turnout election. We seem to be in an era of low turnout elections, and that certainly affects the outcome of many races. You'll see our turnout numbers, but they were historic lows or close to historic lows around the state, and certainly here in Los Angeles County.
With some ballots left to process, we had 34% turnout in the state, which is actually not much better than our city council races, quite honestly. Our last city council race was 29% turnout, and that was not with the statewide races going on. My takeaway is that the state continues to show a strong Democratic edge. We have a number of races where, in our so-called jungle primary, where the Republicans didn't even field a major candidate and therefore didn't even get into the runoff. So there'll be a few races, including the U.S. Senate race, the largest profile one, where there will be no Republican in the fall. So let's go into the governor's race. We have in the governor's race a runoff, and in California, in these statewide elections, even if a candidate gets over 50%, they still have to go through a runoff, the top two, regardless of party. And Gavin Newsom dominated, got by far the most votes. Cox finished fairly well, finished stronger than most people would have expected. There was a question at one point as to whether he would even get in the top two. And my other take on it is Antonio Villaraigosa had a very poor performance. When he entered the race, he was considered perhaps the favorite by many people, and he did not do well at all, and the other candidates never got any traction. What were your thoughts?
The surprise of the race was the poor showing by former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. Really, right up until the last week of the campaign, it was thought to be a close race between Cox and Villaraigosa as to who would come in second and be able to challenge Lieutenant Governor Newsom in the fall. And it turned out not to be a close race, 2-1 for Cox, but really going after completely different voters. Cox was able to consolidate the Republicans, and that was a question early on between him and Travis Allen, between the endorsement by President Trump, which works with Republicans to some extent, but certainly not with the majority of voters in California. But that helped move that race, the Cox-Allen race in the Republican side. Gavin Newsom's been running for governor for 4 years or more, as he's been lieutenant governor for 8 years, and announced as soon as the last gubernatorial election was over that he was running and has been out there running. Villaraigosa came in a little later, but there was plenty of money on both sides in terms of Newsom and Villaraigosa. And what I was talking about earlier, you saw Newsom run ads attacking Cox as Trump's candidate, but in an effort to remind Republicans
to vote for
Cox, so that he got Cox in the runoff.
He helped.
Didn't have to worry about a challenge from Villaraigosa. I assure you, if Newsom knew that Villaraigosa was only running at 13%, he might have not even tried that tactic. So everyone was in a thought process. The polling must have shown them to be much closer, because you saw these campaign tactics employed, and it turned out that Villaraigosa came in at only 13%.
And Newsom he did not hide the fact that he was rooting for Cox to be in second place because he feels he will be the easier candidate to beat. Villaraigosa, of course, didn't even carry the city of Los Angeles or the county of Los Angeles, which he desperately needed to do to finish well. My feeling in November is that really it will be very difficult for Cox to win. Newsom is liberal enough where the margin may be less than what say Brown won by, but I do think that Newsom has a significant edge, and I don't particularly think it'll be close unless, the only thing that I could think of is if there's some issue that takes off, maybe the gas tax, which we saw work in the Republicans' favor in some legislative races, maybe if there's a scandal of some type, unforeseen or unknown at this time, but if it goes like it's going with no impediment, it would seem Newsom's to lose. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just about everyone's going to expect the Democrats to sweep through the races. A couple of races, we only have Democrats in November. We'll get that in a minute. Really, a lot of the talk has to do with what does this do for turnout for some of the other items on the ballot. Most importantly, one, the gas tax repeal, that'll be on the ballot. And two, whether the Democrats can flip any of these congressional seats. There's several Republican congressional seats, some of which have been vacated, so are open seats, and that in terms of nationally changing the majority in the House of Representatives, there's 5 or 6 targeted seats here. And there was a concern that if you didn't have a Republican at the top of the ticket, you don't have one in the U.S. Senate race,
right.
If you didn't have one in the gubernatorial race, you would depress even further Republican turnout and hurt the chances of Republicans maintaining some of those House seats.
And that's a large reason why I think Trump did the endorsement at the last minute, because they were desperately worried that without a decent Republican turnout, with no one to vote for at the top of the ticket, that Republicans would stay home. Now they have a candidate. We'll see if that helps. Even if Cox loses, it might help a few of the legislative races, the House races in particular. Cox did fairly well in some parts out here and in Ventura County, but I still think he's just going to be overwhelmed by the Democratic bent of the state. Let's turn to the U.S. Senate race. This is one of those races that we talked about earlier where the Republicans got completely shut out. The reason I think this happens is that because Republicans have so little chance of winning these big high-profile races, they don't field a major candidate, and they get a lot of Republicans running who are completely unknown. The voters go into the polls and they split their votes among them because they don't know who these people are. None of them really have much money for advertising or promoting themselves. So they all get 5 to 10% of the vote, and then you have 2 higher profile Democrats who wind up winning. Feinstein winning easily over De Leon. I do think that De Leon had some issues at the beginning, and he deprived Feinstein, of course, of the official endorsement of the Democratic Party. That was a pretty big story. But he ran to her left, and he never caught fire. He looks to me like a sure loser in November, especially now that the Republicans either don't vote in this race or they probably most of them vote for Feinstein.
Well, I think she was always going to get the more moderate and independent and Republican vote. De Leon definitely running to the left. There's not a lot of place to go there against the incumbent Democrat. So this is going to be a very, very tough race for him. Dianne Feinstein, who is already 85 years old. I think she'll be 86 when she's sworn in for this term. I think she'll be
the oldest senator
member of the United States Senate, but still seems to be out there doing a decent job. And I think that the voters of California are going to send her back. Now, I have to tell you, James, this is the second time in a row we have a U.S. Senate race with 2 Democrats into.
I could have run for that.
Well, and you would have done better, frankly, than any of the Republicans in this race. But it surprises me that you don't have a Republican. This is the United States Senate, and you don't have I should say legitimate, but really a legitimate Republican candidate step forward. Even if it's, I mean, look what we have in California now. We have sort of a lot of self-funded, multimillionaires, business people that are taking these spots like a John Cox or Meg Whitman or some of these people, but nobody wants to run for the U.S. Senate in California. It's really amazing. And I wonder if that would have been true if Feinstein would have retired and this was an open seat. But I didn't hear a lot of names.
Well, what would have happened, Fred, is that you would have had many Democrats run, and that would have probably allowed a Republican to slip into second place, like the governor's race, perhaps, where you had several named Democrats. I do think that another thing going in Feinstein's favor is that among Republicans, she's not a particular lightning rod of criticism. She doesn't get their ire as much as some of the other Democrats, and I think it's just going to be hard to run against her for De Leon, and any Republican running against her would probably forfeit a good portion of the independent vote. So I think she's going in for another 6 years. And
very popular here in Calabasas, 10 points ahead of the statewide vote. She does very well here in our city.
Another shutout, the lieutenant governor's race, where Kunalakis, former Obama administration official, wins handily. There were two Hernandezes, so we have the Democrat Hernandez winning second place, and Cole Harris, the Republican, who did self-fund a little bit and did manage to do some advertising. He wound up coming very close to getting that second slot, but not quite.
And this is a race where I don't know where this goes. Eleni Koulinakis is new on the scene into elected politics, although has a long history. Ed Hernandez, not a well-known state senator from Southern California, another north-south race, but it's going to be a Democrat as our next lieutenant governor.
Secretary of State, Padilla, the incumbent, one of the few incumbents on the ballot, against Moiser, the Republican. This is a typical race where I see, particularly against a Democratic incumbent, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to unseat him. Last time an elected incumbent was unseated in a regular California election, to my knowledge, was 1976. John Tunney. That's the last time, by S.I. Hayakawa for a U.S. Senate race. So I don't think Moiser has much of a chance.
Yeah, I agree. Alex Padilla is going to continue as our state Secretary of State.
And ditto for the state controller's race, with Betty Yee, the incumbent Democrat, winning easily over Konstantin Roditis, the Republican. The Republicans did manage to get someone into second place, so there is that, but I don't think there's much of a chance here for an upset. The state treasurer's race was open, and there were a number of candidates running for this, and as you can see here, Fiona Ma, who was in the state legislature and most recently on the Board of Equalization, wound up in a solid first. Two Republicans wound up second and third, Conlon and Guerrero. This is a typical race where you see a 60-40 split in the vote. The Democrats get 60% in an open seat, the Republicans get 40%. I don't see that changing.
I agree. I think that's what you're going to see on these down ballot races. The next one is State Attorney General. This had a little twist sort of midway through. David Jones, former state insurance commissioner, had announced early that he was running for State Attorney General, and then with the election of our new United States Senator, Javier Becerra was appointed by the governor, sort of midterm, and became the incumbent by appointment, and that was the end of David Jones, who was, up until that point, thought to be a front runner for this seat, as certainly a leading Democrat.
He ran to the left of Becerra, which I found very interesting because Becerra is pretty liberal Democrat, or at least that's his reputation. And I just don't think he was ever going to unseat him, particularly with the blessings of the Democratic establishment. Becerra's numbers are very strong, and Jones finished a weak third. There was somewhat of a side note. The Bailey and Early, the Republican candidates, were contesting this race pretty heavily in a low-key way, but Bailey wound up on top. I don't see Becerra being defeated. Do you?
No. I think that, as I said, the down-ballot state races are very unlikely to go anywhere other than to the Democrat. Although the state insurance commissioner race is an interesting race. And this is
most interesting, in my opinion, on the ballot.
And I agree. And it's because Steve Poizner doesn't have an R next to his name. He has an I next to his name. He's running as an independent in this race. And I do think that opens up the ability for him, certainly to get independent votes, and maybe even some Democratic votes. He certainly has the most name ID in the race, having previously been on the ballot for statewide office. He's in a dead heat coming out of maybe even a couple percentage points ahead statewide coming out of the primary. Not only is he the independent here, but I think there may be even a feeling as people go down the ballot voting for the Democrats to have someone else, to give one office. They wouldn't vote for the Republican, but for an independent that they have some familiarity with. I think he has a good shot.
This will be the ultimate test as to whether any non-Democrat can get elected statewide. I say non-Democrat because Poizner is going to have money, including some of his own. He was the insurance commissioner, so he's qualified for the job. He's well known in the state, And he's fairly centrist. I mean, he was a Republican, but he was always a moderate Republican. If he can't win in an open seat situation for an innocuous, non-ideological office as an independent against a Democrat, then there's probably very little chance that anyone can. And as you see the numbers here, I will say this. I think Poizner thought he'd do a little better. I think his numbers are a little low because notice there's two other Democrats in the race. So Poizner has his work cut out for him. I think there's a decent shot he wins ultimately, but it's going to be very close.
My favorite commercial of all this time around was for Mahmoud with the cow going, "Vote for Mahmoud."
Anyway, I missed that one, Fred.
But he finished third.
How'd it do?
He finished third.
Fred, let's continue on our election analysis and look at the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Often goes under the radar a little bit. It's a nonpartisan office. It's a statewide office. It's elected. It looks like we have a close race, and I think that's reflective a little bit of the fact people are not that familiar with the candidates.
Well, you say it's flying under the radar. This race may have more spending than any other race, including the governor and U.S. Senate races. This is a classic battle, or it's becoming a classic battle in California between the teacher union candidate and the charter school candidate. There's a lot of money on both sides of that. Marshall Tuck, supported by the charter school advocates, and Tony Thurmond, former state legislator, supported by the teacher union. Very close race here, nonpartisan race. You may not have heard of this office, but you're going to see a lot of commercials and hear a lot about this as we get to the fall.
Board of Equalization in the 3rd District, open. This is another one that a lot of people don't have a lot of information about. There is a partisan affiliation, but as you can see here, the major candidates, there were 4 Democrats who did reasonably well and 1 Republican, so the Republican got the most votes, but the way the district's drawn, this is a Democratic-leaning district pretty heavily.
Yeah, and Tony Vasquez, who is a councilman in the city of Santa Monica, former mayor, is going to be the Democrat and most likely the winner in
over
this
Rick
seat,
Marshall.
this is the seat that represents the city of Calabasas on the Board of Equalization. Our Congressman, Ted Lieu, is going to get reelected to Congress. You know, in this crazy district we have that goes from Calabasas all the way down to Palos Verdes Peninsula. Ted from Torrance, he won that seat in a wild race a few years ago with 14, 15 candidates. He has made quite a name for himself in Congress lately as one of the key resistance spokespeople against President Trump, and he got 58% of the vote in Calabasas, 62% throughout the district, and he'll go on in the fall.
Wright was his opponent last time, and these are similar to the numbers that we saw last time. There just isn't, I mean, Lieu, once he won the open seat in 2014 by a convincing margin against a fairly good Republican candidate, I think the Republicans did not, pay that much attention to this district. It's safe Democrat, I agree with you.
We have a new state assembly member representing the city of Calabasas, and that is Democrat Jesse Gabriel. He was elected to fill the unexpired term of Matt DeBobney, who had been our assembly person, who had resigned, caught up in some of the Me Too allegations at the end of last year, early this year, and he was elected to fill that seat. It's already been sworn in and is representing us. And then he will also move on to that term that he was elected to expires in December, and he's moved on to the November final election against Calabasas' own Justin Clark, a 19-year-old young man, very impressive young man.
Very impressive.
Who goes a student at Cal State Northridge and works in the Commons.
This seat is a 2-to-1 Democrat seat, about 50% registered Democrats, 25% Republican, and 25 Independent. This is not going to be competitive, most likely. But if you notice, we had 3 elections here, actually. We had one in April for the unexpired term, the general election for the unexpired term in June, and then the primary in June. Actually, 4 elections because we have one in November. And the numbers are pretty similar. It looks like the Republicans are capable of getting in the 35 to 40% range, and that's going to be where they top out.
Yeah, the ultimate vote on the short term, filling the unexpired term, where it was just a head-on between Gabriel and Clark, 65-35. That's pretty much exactly the number you're going to see.
Correct.
In November in that race. A little bit of surprise in our countywide offices.
Yes, I was very surprised. Those are the big surprises of the night, I think.
Right. The county sheriff, Jim McDonnell, who was thought to be pretty popular, doing a good job, and was the leader, came in ahead of the other two candidates, but didn't get the 50%. This is a race that if you got 50% plus one, the race would be over, and came in underneath at 48, so he's going to be in a runoff against a retired Sheriff's Department member, Alex Villanueva.
This race shows the widest disparity of any race on the ballot between how Calabasas voted and how the overall district, in this case the county, voted. And if you look around the county, those areas that were a little more conservative, maybe pro-law enforcement, where the Sheriff's Department has a fairly good relationship without much controversy with the community, the incumbent sheriff did very well. McDonald would have won easily if it was, he got 2/3 of the vote out here. But overall in the county, he actually did worse as the incumbent, slightly, than he did last time as a challenger against 6 other people. So I was just shocked. I'm not really sure what to attribute that to.
It was surprising. There was not a big campaign on this. I think you'll see McDonald campaign a lot harder in the fall, and I do expect him to be reelected. But this was
probably
a surprising result, as was with the county assessor. Jeff Prang, our county assessor, also came in at 48% against 3 really unknown challengers. This is the...
Including a perennial candidate, John Low Taxes Low.
Yeah, which, you know...
He came in second.
Came in second, and he'll be the challenger to Prang in the fall. I do expect that Prang will prevail, but he's forced into a fall runoff. Our county supervisor, Sheila Kuehl, not forced into a fall runoff. She has been reelected for another 4-year term against 2. Eric Previn, I think, has run many times.
He's run before.
And there was no funding for any of the challengers in this race. And she came in at, throughout her district, 76%, and out in Calabasas at 69%.
I saw nothing. I mean, I saw no campaign on either side. She didn't spend any money, really, or go out there much, but she didn't need to. So going through the propositions, we have 5 propositions, none of which was a hot-button issue. Proposition 68 would authorize $4 billion in general obligations bonds for parks and natural resources and such, and it passed fairly easily in both the state and the city. As you can see, the state was 57-43. Proposition 69 was just basically saying that transportation revenue expenditures from a recent bill had to be spent on transportation. I didn't see that ever having a chance of failing. It seemed like just a restatement of what logically people wanted in voting for the original bill, and it passed by a 4-to-1 margin. Proposition 70, this was the only proposition on the ballot that didn't pass. It requires a legislative supermajority for the use of cap-and-trade funds. What do you attribute that to?
You know, you get down to this part of the ballot and to these kind of measures, and people are looking to, you know, newspaper endorsements and slates and other things. Everybody had no on this, and I think that's what happened here.
And you know another thing about it? The studies have shown this. If you have a confusing proposition with a lot of technical details, if people wind up not understanding it, that they will generally vote no pretty solidly. And I think that had to do with it a little bit. Do you not?
No, I agree. And it's interesting, James, a lot of the 2/3 majorities, as they've gone back on the ballot and they've been asked to be reduced, whether it be for school bonds and other kinds of bonds, the voters have reduced those majorities. There may be some view, you know, by the voters that something closer to either majority or 55% is more fair.
Going to Proposition 71, this was just a house cleaning bill that established the effective date for the implementation of ballot measures. Normally when a proposition passes, unless it states otherwise, which it often does, but if it doesn't state, then it takes effect the night at 8 p.m. on the night of the election, which makes logistically things hard, particularly if it's a close race and if there are things like sentencing rules that need to be done for criminal cases. So this just says that it gives a definitive date of 5 days after the certification of the election for when they take effect, and it passed overwhelmingly, no opposition.
Well, and this also is part of our new election rules in California. We've had a lot of changes in election rules, mostly in an effort to try and up turnout and make it easier for people to vote. You really can't do what we had before anymore because the election's not over on election night. You're allowed to mail in your ballot. Ballots collected that received for the next 3 days are still can be counted. And it's taking up to a month for these elections to be certified, with lots of ballots coming in late. So election night has changed. The good old days of sort of declaring victory on election night, in a lot of cases, it's just not possible anymore.
Proposition 72, another issue where the no side, nobody opposed this really that I saw at all. This was the exclusion of RainCapture systems from property tax reassessments. If you want to upgrade your RainCapture, I mean, it was a conservation measure, passed, almost with 90% of the vote, 85 to 15 statewide, and a little better in Calabasas. I mean, you can tell these aren't hot button issues because the state and the city pretty much voted the same. There was no disparity, there was no controversy, and they all went very solidly one way or the other. We have a number of propositions in November that will be much, much more hotly contested. Speaking of which, is the gas tax, I think, will be front and center. If there is an issue that helps Republicans in November to win a few of these tough races, it will be something like the gas tax. We see in polling it's about a 50-50 proposition, which is better than what Republicans normally get on their issues here in the state. It was powerful enough, I think, to cost a state senator his seat by an almost 60-40 margin in a swing district to the east of us, and cost the Democrats their supermajority in the state legislature. I did not see that coming. It must resonate with voters because they were upset that he cast what they termed the deciding vote in the legislature. Do you think the issue could be that powerful?
I do. I think that it is an issue that will bring a lot of people out to the polls, especially Republicans, even when they're not seeing a candidate that they view as viable for some of the top tier offices. I do think that gas tax repeal is going to be something that brings them out. And frankly, I think it's an issue that resonates with Democrats and independents as well. If gasoline prices remain high as they are now, as we speak here today, you see $4 a gallon gas prices is driving around. I think this repeal is going to pass. Because I think that it's something that is tangible to people, and while the voters are willing to vote for transportation bonds and so forth, when they're filling up their tank and it's costing them 40, 50, 60 bucks a shot to do that, I don't think they're very happy.
Does it cost the Democrats some seats that they otherwise would have gotten? Not the governor or senator necessarily. I mean, Cox has made it clear he's going to run on that issue largely, and I don't know that it may help him a little bit. I don't know that it propels him into office. But say in a close legislative race in a swing district, does it help?
I think it can. There aren't too many of those. What are we going to see in November? We're going to see California, for the first time in a long time, be somewhat of a national focus in terms of the congressional election. I mean, we haven't been a focus in presidential elections for a long time. We've been a fait accompli to the Democrat. But here, in trying to flip the Congress, there's going to be, 30 or 40 districts around the country that are going to be battlegrounds where millions of dollars are going to be spent, and you're going to be hearing about them. And 5 or 6 of those are here in California. One of them bordering us just immediately to the north, the Steve Knight district in the Santa Clarita area. So that's what's going to be a focus that we haven't seen on a national perspective in a long time. And to the extent that gas tax brings out, some more conservative voters or conservative-leaning independents, those races in Orange County, in Santa Clarita, those congressional races could definitely be affected.
The Republicans weren't able to shut out the Democrats in any of those congressional races like they had hoped, but I will say, I think from what I hear, the Republicans are not displeased with their turnout. There had been talk that perhaps the Republican base wouldn't show up at all, and you'd start seeing the Democrats get majorities in these races. That generally didn't happen. If you combine the Republican vote, in most cases the incumbent, versus the combined Democratic vote, the Republicans generally got a little bit more. And I think they felt hopeful about that. We'll see what the national environment is. It could turn on a very few number of votes, Fred, or one issue at the last minute that comes in, maybe an international something or some comment made by the president or something along those lines. Who knows? But I think it's going to be close, and you're right. To the extent that the the change in the jungle primary was made to attract more attention to these races, it has.
Turnout, turnout, turnout is really the key issue in November. The Democrats, to win those seats, are really going to have to get their voters out. These races that we had, it didn't excite the base. I mean, you didn't,
No.
Newsom and Villaraigosa and Chang and Easton did not bring the voters out.
No.
Dianne Feinstein and Kevin DeLeon did not bring the voters out. And so they need to bring those voters out, not so much to win the statewide seats, but to try to win these congressional races and to defeat the gas tax repeal if that's important to them. And I don't know what.
And there's some criminal justice
see.
reform bills too. I mean, there's a whole bunch of criminal justice reform bills that are going to be on the ballot that conservatives may come out to vote for too. Right. Fred, as always, after 13 years, we both have a little more gray, and but
a lot more gray.
Well, some of us have a lot more gray, but it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to coming back here in November and doing another post-election analysis with you.
Always enjoyable to do this, and I hope it's informative for our residents here in Calabasas.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the City of Calabasas, thank you for watching our post-election analysis with my colleague Fred Gaines and myself, James Bozajian.